Hi YouTube, it's Joshua Miles and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at possibly the biggest case that I've ever covered on my channel. It's a tale of pain, mental illness and horrors from beyond belief. It was a case submitted to me through my requestacase.com website, which is where you can send in any case suggestions that you may have to be covered on this channel. You can also vote on existing cases posted there, which makes them more likely to be covered. Just head on over to requestacase.com and send them in there. This case has been split up into a few parts to make it more digestible, but a mega video with the entire case and all the parts all together will be published after everything is live, if that's more your thing. You're currently watching part 1. And with that being said, let's delve into the horror case of Wayne Adam Ford. Victim 1. Sunday the 26th of October 1997, Myrtletown, California, the United States. A man by the name of Bob Potberg, who had been a photographer, had been kayaking with a few of his friends in the freshwater creek that runs around the northeast border of the neighborhood. It had been at about 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon when Bob had kayaked around a bend just south of Murrayfield Airport when he noticed a white object ahead of him on the north bank. The white object contrasted against the neutral tones of the freshwater slough and its banks, and Bob was drawn to it. He kayaked closer to get a better look, as curiosity started to get the better of him. And that was when the nature of this white object began to become clearer. It looked to have been the buttocks of a mannequin, or at least Bob hoped it to have been that of a mannequin. A deep fear, an instinctual urge to get away from the white object flooded Bob as the alarm bells in his head screamed at him that he'd been staring at a body. One of the friends that Bob had been with had worked at a local hospital, and so Bob asked her to go check it out, but she refused to do so as she too was petrified that it had been an actual body. Another one of Bob's friends had been kayaking with his 4-year-old child in the kayak, and his protective instincts kicked in, causing him to paddle further down the river away from the possibility of human remains in order to protect his toddler. Bob swallowed his fear and paddled closer to the white object until he had been within the right range to use his paddle to prod it. Bob hoped and prayed that when he prodded the object, he would hear and feel that it had been made of some kind of hard plastic or polystyrene or something synthetic. So when he felt the white object squish under the pressure of the paddle's prod, Bob freaked out. Bob also noticed that there had been a yellow material on the white object, and it dawned on him that this yellow had actually been exposed fatty tissue, as if body parts had been surgically removed. It was at that point that he called back to his friends that it had been real, and they called 911. Bob agreed to meet with an officer from the Eureka Police Department nearby, and when he spoke with the officer and described what he had come across, it appeared to Bob as if the officer was being dismissive by telling Bob that they found bodies in the slough every year. It wasn't until Bob explained that he hadn't just found a body, he had found a torso with surgical cuts, that the officer took him seriously. Though when Bob explained that the location of the body had been on the north bank, the officer held up his hands and stated that that was the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office responsibility and that they should be handling this case, as the Eureka Police Department's jurisdiction had only been on the south bank of the slough. After what seemed like ages, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Lieutenant Deputy Coroner and an officer from the California Department of Fish and Game traveled by boat to the area where the torso had been to retrieve it. The torso was entered into the system as Jane 19498 Doe, but due to the torso missing the breasts, it was given the nickname of Torso Girl. It had been on the 27th of October 1997, the day after the discovery in the slough, that Detective Juan Freeman was assigned to be the lead detective on the case. Quote, "I was pretty sure I had the work of a serial killer in front of me. It had been Detective Freeman's first task to establish a list of identifiers of the remains, such as an approximate height, hair colour, and the likes. These identifiers would be pinnacle in finding out who exactly their Jane Doe had been. Detective Freeman had hoped that the autopsy, which had been scheduled for the 29th of October, would shed some light on the investigation. The autopsy was conducted by pathologist Robert Lawrence, alongside a forensic anthropologist and skeleton expert by the name of Charles Cecil. The coroner, the coroner's deputy, a sheriff's deputy who worked in the coroner's division, and Detective Freeman were all also present for the autopsy. The autopsy itself took about 2 hours, and it allowed Detective Freeman to learn a considerable amount about the Jane Doe victim. It revealed that the Jane Doe had been a 18 to 25-year-old white woman with some possible Hispanic background. Further, it had appeared that the Jane Doe had given birth at some point in her life. She had stood at around 5'3" to 5'4" with brown or auburn hair. Using the levels of carbon in the Jane Doe's lungs, they were able to establish that she had come from an area with little air pollution and that Jane Doe had likely been a non-smoker. These were all important markers that could help Detective Freeman give Jane Doe her name back. The pathologist then looked closer at the wounds that had been inflicted upon the Jane Doe. We're not going to be examining this portion of the autopsy report in vivid detail, as I feel like you can get an idea of what Jane Doe went through without needing to discuss the particulars. What we will touch on though was that Jane Doe had suffered 27 stab wounds to the right side of her back and buttocks, with all but one having been inflicted after death. Notably and obviously, Jane Doe had been dismembered, and to sum up their findings, it hadn't been carried out with any surgical precision, and it appeared to have been carried out in a similar way that a hunter may dismember an animal carcass. When it came to examining if sexual assault had occurred, the pathologist was unable to find any trace of semen in or on Jane Doe's body. This had largely been due to 2 factors. The first being that her remains had been in the water of the slough for some time, and the second had been due to the fact that Jane Doe's genitals had been cut out of her body. The cause of death could not be determined. The investigation following the autopsy saw investigators using cadaver dogs to search the water and the banks of the slough to see if they could locate any more remains connected to Jane Doe. While the dogs did alert to some driftwood near where the body had been recovered, which they put down to the driftwood having retained the body's scent, no more remains were located. Detective Freeman submitted Jane Doe's identifiers to the Department of Justice's Missing and Unidentified Persons database. He initially asked for a search to be conducted comparing Jane Doe's characteristics against young women who were reported to have gone missing between the 20th of October and the 26th of October. Detective Freeman further made contact with FBI profilers and Department of Justice profilers and reached out to other agencies to see if they had any cases similar to his. And within a year, Detective Freeman had ascertained around 100 leads on missing women who could fit the profile of his victim. Though, whenever he tried to compare DNA, it had never come back as a match. On the 18th of December 1997, Detective Freeman met up with 2 profilers that he'd contacted from the state's Department of Justice. These 2 profilers had actually been asked to travel to Eureka in order to look into the case of Karen Mitchell for the Eureka Police Department, which was a case that was being ostensibly connected to that of the Torso Jane Doe case. Karen Mitchell had gone missing 5 days before her birthday on the 25th of November 1997. She'd been living with her auntie and her uncle Bill Casper, who had actually been the head criminalist at the State Department of Justice Crime Lab in Eureka. Karen had last been seen leaving her aunt's shop at the Bayshore Mall, walking along Broadway to the Coastal Family Developmental Center, which had been where Karen took care of children. It's my understanding that the authorities at the time believed that the person responsible for the disappearance of Karen Mitchell had been somehow connected and or responsible for the murder of the Jane Doe, dubbed as Torso Girl, found a month before Karen went missing. Karen's case is unsolved to this day, and I've left the link to the Charlie Project page on Karen's case in the description if you'd like to find out more information, or let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in my coverage of Karen's case. The 2 profilers that had travelled to Eureka to look into Karen's case also met with Detective Freeman with regards to the Jane Doe Torso Girl case, and they both agreed that they thought the 2 cases had been related. The 2 profilers theorized that the killer had likely been a white man in his 40s who had killed many times before, and who generally did not intend for his victims to be found. They further suggested that the killer in the Jane Doe case had been proud of his handiwork, and so had dumped the remains in a place where somebody would find her. The profilers believed that the killer had been someone who felt it had been safe to commit crimes without being caught while transporting the remains. Then the killer had worked a regular job due to the fact that the remains had been dumped over a weekend. Further, they suggested that the killer had lived nearby to Eureka, had been a frequent visitor, or had lived there before. They stressed that the killer must have had a crucial knowledge and understanding of the area, as he needed to be able to park close enough to the slough so that he wouldn't be seen dumping the remains. The profilers recommended that Detective Freeman should establish what had been in the stomach of the Jane Doe, as according to them, these types of murderers rarely had sexual intercourse with their victims. Rather, they typically forced oral sex, and so the stomach contents could contain semen with DNA evidence, though it must be noted that the pathologist had actually dumped the contents of the victim's stomach during the autopsy and trying to determine whether there had been pills in the stomach, so this was a lead that could not be realized. Finally, the two profilers requested that Detective Freeman should try to figure out where exactly the victim had actually been thrown into the slough. They hypothesized that there could be more body parts in a sunken container or something similar near to the site in which the remains were dumped into the slough. It was suggested that Detective Freeman pick a day in which the tides had been similar to that of the weekend the body was found, and then use weighted bags thrown into the slough from suspected dumping locations to see where the current takes them. If any of those weighted bags ended up close to where the remains were found, they had a strong contender for the dumping site, which should be searched for evidence. It wasn't long before a break was made in the case. On the 29th of January 1998, two people who had been cutting driftwood at the beach in McKinleyville came across a horror from their nightmares: a left arm, sunburned and dried out. This finding was immediately reported to the authorities, and Detective Freeman ordered DNA tests to see if the arm could be a match for either Karen Mitchell or their Jane Doe case. The hand of the arm was sent to the Department of Justice lab to see if it was possible to rehydrate the arm enough in order to take a set of usable fingerprints to compare against state and national fingerprint databases. Could they finally find the identity of their Jane Doe? The following day, on the 30th of January 1998, a team of investigators meticulously searched the shore from Clam Beach south to the Mad River, which flowed from the mountains through Arcata and emptied into the ocean near McKinleyville. However, no other body parts or remains were found. Detective Freeman waited on the edge of his seat throughout February and into March before he got the results back on the DNA from the arm, and it had been a match with the DNA of that of his Jane Doe torso case. It had also been reported that the left arm appeared to have been sawed partway through, which had been consistent of that of the marks found on their Jane Doe's left shoulder. This is where the investigation took a turn into the paranormal and spiritual realms, and in part due to the length this coverage is going to be, and also in part due to respect for the victim, I'm only going to briefly touch on this. Detective Freeman decided to consult with a psychic by the name of Kay Rhea, who he had actually consulted with before on different cases. Now, it must be noted that allegedly many of the details that this psychic had provided had turned out to be true, though she had offered these details in the wrong context. From Detective Freeman's report on this consultation, he wrote, quote, "Kay asked me to describe the general location where Jane Doe was found. I did this, and Kay told me the victim had dark brown hair, but not black hair." The psychic gave the detective a bunch of predictions that I don't personally feel to be respectful to include in this coverage, but I will leave you with this short extract from the reports. Quote, "Kay said that this person is not a serial killer type guy. She said his ability to have sex is low because he has a small penis." Okay, I can't believe I just said that on my YouTube channel, but okay. Bringing this coverage back to the realms of reality, Detective Freeman did attempt to use weighted bags to see whether they could figure out the dump site of the remains. Though, due to bad weather conditions, the exercise had to be cancelled in December, January and in February. The next attempt had been on the 16th of March. Detective Freeman, alongside Deputy Roy Reynolds, had researched the area's tidal patterns and had filled about 18 burlap sacks with enough wood chips and empty plastic bottles to equate to the same weight as the Jane Doe torso. They then tried placing the bags intermittently along the slough. However, they actually ended up having to abort the exercise due to the fact that they had run out of time. And around the same time as this flotation experiment taking place, the coroner's office buried the remains of Jane Doe in Potter's Field, which is described as an indigent section of Ocean View Cemetery in Eureka. The experiment was conducted again on the 5th of May, though this time with a larger team to assist. They filled 21 gunny sacks and placed them in 4 pots of the slough where they believed the remains had most likely been dumped from. 2 out of those 21 sacks stood out to Detective Freeman, bag 14 and bag 18. Bag 14 had been placed near Park Street Bridge and had come to rest about 100 feet away from where the the Jane Doe torso had been located. Bag 18 had been placed near the Devoy Road Bridge, which is about 1.5 miles downstream from bag 14, and it also ended up where the Jane Doe torso was located. Though it must be noted that bag 18 took 3 complete tidal cycles for it to get close to the discovery location, and as it was believed that the remains had been in the water for less than 24 hours, Detective Freeman established that the Park Street Bridge was the more likely place to have been the dumping site. If the murderer had dumped the remains there at dawn on the 26th of October 1997, it would have been able to float to its final resting place by the time the tide went out that evening. After the experiments, the case's investigation grew colder and colder. In the year following the discovery of the Jane Doe, Detective Freeman determined a half dozen possible suspects through liaisoning with other agencies around the state, but none of the possible suspects would turn out to be the killer. Quote, "What I found out during this investigation is that a lot of people do really weird things." Detective Freeman had been deeply upset that throughout the years since the discovery of Jane Doe, they still hadn't been able to give the Jane Doe her name back. Victim 2. 6 p.m. on Tuesday the 2nd of June 1998, Buttonwillow, California. 4 men who had worked for a construction company reported finding the nude body of a woman hung up on the steel cable of alternating red and white buoys that spans the California aqueduct. 2 sheriff's deputies responded to the call, who confirms the reports of the human remains, and subsequently a homicide team was called in. The woman in the water appeared to have been in the water for some time, and so the authorities had been initially unable to identify the remains. Detective Gary Rhodes had received the call about the discovery at just before 7 p.m. The woman's body had been found about 40 feet downstream from the Highway 58 bridge, which crossed the aqueduct. The steel cable that the body had been hung up on had been meant to be a safety device for people who had inadvertently fallen into the water, and as the woman's body had been found in the nude and face down, Detective Rose determines that his Jane Doe hadn't accidentally fallen into the water while fishing. The detectives searched the banks of the aqueduct and the bridge for any kind of evidence, such as tire tracks or clothing, but they found nothing. There'd been no obvious signs of foul play, such as a gunshot wound or stabbing, and so Detective Rhodes took photographs of the Jane Doe and then pulled her by the arm to the shore, which was where she was placed into a body bag. At around 9:30 p.m, the detectives had moved the remains into a van for transportation to the coroner's office to undergo an autopsy, though they had learned some initial facts about their Jane Doe. She had been 5'5", had blue eyes, and had reddish blonde hair. Quote, "The next day, a detective and an evidence technician went to the morgue in Bakersfield to try to roll a set of fingerprints, but her skin was too decomposed." The autopsy commenced 2 days after the discovery on Thursday the 4th of June 1998, and Detective Rhodes had been present alongside his partner on the case, Detective Taylor. The pathologist had been Dr. Donna Brown, and this is what she found during the autopsy. The victim had pre-mortem, so inflicted before death, dime-sized bruises to the left side of her jaw along her cheek, had scrapes on her temple and chin, had a fractured neck, and the neck was circled with a linear mark, as if she'd been strangled by something, and had deep bruising in the cheek and in the voice box area. Dr. Donna Brown did conduct a sexual assault kit and took a blood sample in order to use in the future to try and match the DNA with a suspect. Of note, the Jane Doe victim wore 5 rings on her left hand and had a tattoo of the letters JJ in a heart on the web between her thumb and first finger. There had also been a ring on her right ring finger. The pathologist removed the victim's hands and used a chemical solution to soak the skin of the hands in the hopes that it could improve the chances of obtaining fingerprints. It was through this technique that the investigators were finally able to ascertain usable fingerprints, which was entered into the Department of Justice's Western Identification Network and the FBI's databases. The detectives searched the missing persons files to see if they could find anything, but to no avail. It wasn't until the 29th of July that a break in the case was made, when a fingerprint was matched with a girl from Tacoma, Tina Renee Gibbs. Tina Renee Gibbs had been born on the 20th of April 1972 in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to parents Carlos and Mary. When Tina had been around 18 months old, her mother Mary took her and left Carlos in October of 1973 and went to Georgia. When Tina had been 7 years old, her mother Mary began a relationship with an Army police investigator by the name of Ron Sharp. Within months, Tina had begun to call Ron, quote, daddy, and it wasn't long before Ron and her mother Mary would get married. According to reports, quotes, on all levels bar genetic, Ron had been Tina's father. As a child, Tina was described as someone who had been happy-go-lucky, a kid that loved going to the beach and singing, what her mother called oldies but goldies. Tina loved to play with her cats and enjoyed going fishing. She loved going to the carnivals and to the circus to watch the animals perform. It had been Ron, Tina's stepdad, who had taught her how to swim, and it had been Ron who had taught Tina how to play softball. As Tina became a teenager, she would begin to alternate between being what could be described by some as a girly girl and a tomboy. She would hang out with her mother, fixing each other's hair, crocheting together, going shopping and cooking together. And as Tina grew up, it had been her house that had become the place that Tina and her friends would hang out, playing pool and listening to music together. The family had stayed in Georgia until Ron decided to leave the army, which saw the family moving to Oklahoma for 6 to 8 months. Though Ron had quickly become bored of this slower pace and wanted to dive back into what he considered to be real policing work. The family of 3 then moved to the state of Washington. In 1991, when Tina had been 18 years old, Ron and Mary decided that they wanted to move to Oregon from Washington state, and Tina had decided that she wanted to stay put in Washington state as she had fallen in love with a man and she had decided that she wanted to stand on her own 2 feet. Tina's mother Mary saw this as cause for concern, as she knew in her guts that Tina had been experimenting with drugs and that she had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Ron, though, thought that Tina had simply grown up and that she was, quote, ready to rule the world. Quote, she called me one day and asked me if I would come and pick her up so she could come home, and that's when we found out that she was messing with drugs. We were her sole support. Anything that she wanted, we gave it to her. Mary and Ron both tried to talk Tina into counselling and to get her off the drugs, but they had not been successful. And their move to Oregon came round quickly. Once they had moved to Oregon, they only heard from Tina a couple of times a year. It's unclear at what point, but at some point, Mary and Ron moved to Oklahoma. When they did so, they lost contact with Tina completely. The last time that Tina's mother Mary remembered speaking with Tina had been in 1994, possibly on Christmas Eve. Mary recalled, quote, begging her to come home, and Tina had agreed to come home with her mother, but she sadly never followed through. Tina's mother Mary, in the years that followed, tried to track down Tina through her friends. She hung on to the hope that Tina might one day get her life together, knock on the door or give her a call. We can only establish what Tina had gotten up to in the years after that through the police records, which showed that she had been arrested more than a dozen times. Tina had been arrested 5 times for soliciting prostitution in 1995 and in early 1996, which was before she had moved to Las Vegas. The final arrest on her record had been in Tacoma on the 11th of January 1996. Detective Rhodes spoke to the Las Vegas Police Department and was able to confirm that Tina had been a sex worker in Las Vegas. Quote, the sergeant told me that all of her last addresses and places where they'd last contacted her were parts of the city known for prostitution at the time. Tina had last been cited by the police on the 6th of May 1998, which had been less than a month before her body was found, and she was cited after giving false information to a police officer, though these charges were dropped, quote, per negotiations. It had been in early August of 1998 when Tina's mother Mary had come home from work to find her husband Ron just standing behind the front door, as if he had been waiting for a while for her to arrive. Mary instantly knew that something was very wrong. You see, Ron had received a message to contact the coroner's office in Kern County, California earlier that afternoon, and the coroner's office had told Ron what they could, which hadn't actually been all that much at all, as they had mostly focused on what they wanted to do with Tina's remains. Ron had now been left with one of the most difficult jobs in the world, telling a mother, his wife, that her only daughter had been murdered. Ron told Mary to sit down on the couch before he told her the news in the gentlest way he could. Whatever Ron did, he would be unable to stop Mary from feeling what she described as, quote, the most gut-wrenching sorrow that a mother could feel. Mary actually ended up in the hospital the next day due to her body being overcome by the grief. The mental anguish had paralyzed Mary so much that she had to be hospitalized on 5 occasions for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. Mary would try to return, but she quickly realized that she couldn't handle it, and Mary would actually become medically disabled, and according to Ron, she would never be able to work again because of the sheer grief she experienced at the loss of her daughter. Victim 3. Friday the 25th of September 1998. 3 men pulled over to change a plug wire in a gravel turnout along Highway 12 near Lodi, just west of Interstate 5. The men quickly noticed in an irrigation ditch that had been parallel to the road that there had been the naked body of a woman floating. One of the men went across the street to an industrial building and asked somebody to call 911. And when the Delta Fire Department had arrived, all 3 of those men had left the scene of the discovery. The fire department contacted the sheriff's office, and when the deputies arrived, they ordered the firefighters to back their engines out in the exact same way that they had entered the turnout in order to not disturb the death scene any further. And once the firefighters had done so, the police cordoned off the area so that the homicide team could get to work. The body of the woman had been floating upright in shallow water near a large walnut tree. The investigators collected about 15 items from the death scene, including a brown leather glove and a plastic royal blue tarp, both of which were found floating near the body. Further, they collected a white plastic bag, which had come to rest against some weeds about 30 yards away from the body. The bag had been marked with what appeared to have been blood, and had a logo on the back for Flying J, which was a national chain of truck stops. This gave the investigators their first major clue. The killer might have been a truck driver. This was further supported by tyre tracks that had been left in the gravel, though the tracks weren't clear enough to identify the tyre pattern by brand. As the victim had been found in the water, the investigators had to call in the sheriff's boat crew to recover the remains. The victim's body showed no major visible wounds or bruises, which stood out as unusual to the investigators for a woman who had been dumped naked. They initially suspected that the victim had been strangled. The victim's hands were bagged by the investigators to protect them for fingerprinting, before loading her into the van at about 4:50 p.m, where she was transported to the San Joaquin County Hospital to undergo full-body x-rays before being taken to the county morgue. It was at the morgue that the investigators were able to roll a set of fingerprints from the victim, which was subsequently entered into the California ID system, which can take up to an hour on a good day to get a hit. The autopsy of the victim was conducted the following day, on Saturday the 26th of September 1998, and the pathologist carried out a sexual assault kit and took 3 vials of blood. The autopsy reveals that the skin of the victim's neck had been marked with a chain-like pattern, and there had been no internal hemorrhaging beneath. An injury was found on the back of the head, though it had been unclear if it had been an old injury or a new one. Ultimately, the autopsy was unable to determine how exactly the victim had died. Quote, "We were hoping for something, a stab wound or something that said yes, it was homicide." Regardless, the investigation continued to treat the case as a homicide. It was determined that the state of decomposition may have masked some findings, with the detectives hoping that the cause of death may present itself once the tox screens returned. As they waited, the pathologist deems the cause of death to preliminary have been, quote, "homicidal violence of unknown ideology." Fortunately, the identity of the Jane Doe in this case would soon reveal itself due to the fingerprint search. The fingerprints returned a match for 25-year-old Lynette White. Lynette White had been born on the 11th of November 1972 in Upload, California, to parents Deborah and Bill White. She'd been the eldest of what would be 2 children born to the family, who lived together in a duplex in Ontario. Lynette's mother, Deborah, had stayed home to take care of Lynette, who was described as being a wonderful child, albeit a bit fussy, while Lynette's father, Bill, worked construction. Lynette had enjoyed the circus as a child, so much so that she had even dressed up as a bearded lady for her kindergarten class when it had performed a mock circus. She had also been athletic from a young age, having run track for her elementary school and practiced karate for 2.5 years. Notably, Lynette actually quit karate before she had earned a black belt after she had lost a tournament fight to a boy. She didn't think it was fair that girls had to compete against boys. When Lynette had been 13 years old, her younger brother was born, and she went from being an only child to having a sibling. Lynette used to go with her family to SeaWorld in San Diego together, and they even went to go watch drag races as a family. When Lynette had been in the 9th grade, she stopped attending school and would instead go to her aunt's house or ride about on her bike. It had also been at around this time that Lynette became what her friends and family described as, quote, boy crazy. And Lynette had been more enthusiastic about boys than most. The day after Lynette's 16th birthday, on the 12th of November 1988, Lynette gave birth to a daughter who she called Amanda. Lynette had parented this baby with her boyfriend at the time, a boy by the name of Robert, and it had been almost a year after the birth of Amanda that Lynette gave birth to a second child with Robert, who they called Carlos. In March of 1995, Lynette and Robert welcomed their third child, Michael, into the world. Now, it is important to note that in January of 1998, Lynette did have a another child by the name of David, but this child had not been the son of Robert. It's unclear when and why Robert and Lynette had split up. Though what we do know is that Lynette loved to cook for her children, especially Mexican food. Amanda, Lynette's eldest, would later describe Lynette by saying, quote, "She was really fun. Instead of a mother, she was more like a friend." You see, Lynette loved her family, but she was also described as somebody who loved to have a good time. And Lynette needed to find a way to pay for this good time. Lynette had been 21 years old when she had first been arrested on the 28th of September 1994 for trying to cash a stolen check for $500 at the Vineyard National Bank. It would be the first time of many that Lynette would encounter the law when it came to forged and stolen checks. Lynette would also be later described as someone who had parties to sell home interior products, being recorded by the police as being unemployed. Quote, "It was so unusual for Lynette to have any money, as she never worked and didn't have any means of obtaining a check." In January of 1995, a detective tried to reach Lynette by phone, but had been unable to, so he tried again in February, though this time he had gone to the apartments that Lynette shared with her parents in Chino, but to no avail. Subsequently, on the 7th of February, the detective put a, quote, "stop and hold" order out for Lynette. Lynette was arrested by 4 p.m. that same day and was charged with 2 counts of commercial burglary, 2 counts of forging checks, and 1 count of being under the influence of methamphetamines. Lynette ended up agreeing to a plea deal, which saw her sentenced to 120 days in jail and 3 years probation. She was allowed to serve her time in a weekend program from 7 p.m. Friday until 7 p.m. Sunday, though a month before Lynette was due to commence her jail time in November of 1995, which had been the same year that her 3rd child was born, Lynette was arrested again for being under the influence of methamphetamines. Lynette would find herself arrested yet again on the 13th of October 1995, in which she admitted that she had snorted, quote, "a little line" earlier that day. Due to her prior convictions, however, Lynette was ineligible to join the drug diversion program. In July of 1998, the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Child Support Division filed a complaint against Lynette, in which they were seeking a monthly $370 in child support for her eldest child, Amanda. The last time that Lynette's mother, Deborah, had seen Lynette had been on the 16th of September 1998, 3 days before Deborah's actual birthday. Lynette had brought over a birthday cake to her mother's place and told her that she'd be back for her actual birthday to celebrate. Lynette had always been super thoughtful, especially around birthdays and other special occasions. It had been 7 days later when Deborah had got a phone call from her sister on Tuesday the 22nd of September. Deborah's sister told her that Lynette had gone to Baker's restaurant to pick up a check on Sunday the 20th of September and had never come back. 3 days later, on the 25th of September, an Ontario police officer arrived at Deborah and Bill's apartment and notified them that Lynette might have been, quote, "involved in a homicide," before urging them to contact the San Joaquin County detectives who had been working on the case. Bill, who was Lynette's father, had decided that he should go with his son to the payphone just down the street to make the call. Meanwhile, Deborah, who was Lynette's mother, went into shock. When Bill made the phone call, he was connected to Detective Mike Jones, who asked them if they knew why Lynette might have been up in Northern California. Bill told the detective that he didn't know why she'd been up there. Then the detective asked Bill where Lynette had been living. Bill told him that Lynette had been living in Fontana with her 2 youngest children, and that she'd been living with her cousin by the name of Charlotte. After a bit of further conversation, the detective became more serious before saying, quote, "Sir, well, I have some bad news for you. We found a young female in a waterway, deceased, near Lodi. We have tentatively identified her by fingerprints, and it is Lynette." Bill then went back to the apartment and broke the news to Deborah before they decided to tell Lynette's oldest child, Amanda. Sadly, Lynette's parents hadn't much money, and due to the state of decomposition that Lynette had been in, they decided that their only option had been to cremate her. The ashes were sent to them, and after they received them, they held a service for Lynette at a local mortuary. Quote, "I had to take my baby out of there in a box, holding her like that. I never thought I'd ever have to go through something like that. Your kids, they go from an accident, car wreck, stuff like that. But something like this, there's no excuse for it. No excuse in this world for it. On Monday, the 28th of September, Detective Mike Jones, the same detective who had notified them of Lynette's death, drove the 10-hour drive to Fontana. The detective arrived at Deborah's sister's house at around 7:45 p.m. and entered the home in order to ask Lynette's parents, Deborah and Bill, further questions. Deborah told the detectives that Lynette had lived with them up until the first part of September, which was when they had to kick her out, though Deborah did not elaborate as to why she had to kick Lynette out. The detective also spoke with Bill and took Bill out to the police car to show him a photo of Lynette's tattoos so that he could confirm her identity. The detective reassured Bill that he wasn't going to show him any photos of Lynette's face or anything graphic. The detective did warn Bill about what he was going to see, though, telling him, quote, "I'm going to show you a picture of her back. The picture is not pretty." Bill burst into tears after seeing what had happened to his daughter. Quote, "He's a pretty brave man, and I think it's messed with him ever since then. It's like he never used to cry very much, but now I always see him crying. I mean, he tries to act like he's not, but I know when he's crying. And it's just like, you know, a heartbreaking, awful, terrible thing for someone to have to go through." That same night, Monday the 28th of September, the detective spoke with the cousin that Lynette lived with, Charlotte Bailey. Interestingly, Charlotte admitted to the detectives that she had smoked a dime bag of meth on the last day that she had seen her alive. She further explains that Lynette had lived with her in Fontana for 3 or 4 weeks before Lynette had been murdered, and that she and Lynette had frequented a liquor store that was around the corner. It's important to note that just a couple of miles down the road from Charlotte's place in Fontana had been several truck stops, such as the Fontana truck stop, Three Sisters truck stop, and Truck Town. It is also important to establish that sex workers had been known to frequent these places. What isn't known is how Lynette actually ended up at one of those places, as they were far too far away to have walked there, especially in high heels. It had been through these interviews with Lynette's family and friends that the detectives managed to create a rough timeline of events on the day that Lynette went missing, Sunday the 20th of September. They had established that early that Sunday, Lynette and Charlotte had smoked some meth at their friend's house before returning back to Charlotte's place in the afternoon. Then, at some time between 5:15 and 6 p.m, Lynette had pushed her baby in the stroller to the corner liquor store in order to call her friend, who we'll call Darren, after which she had returned back to Charlotte's place with a bottle of Cisco. Another one of Lynette's cousins, who we'll call Lucy for privacy protection purposes, told the detectives that Lynette had gone outside the house and had spoken to a big guy in a white pickup truck as Charlotte had been taking a nap. This, quote, big guy was described as being a white guy, about 6 foot tall with greying hair, a thick mustache, and tattooed arms. Now, it's important to note that this guy would later be identified to have been a 52-year-old Ralph Edward Bishop III, and he would admit to having used 1/4 gram of meth every day, and that he could not account for his whereabouts on that night. At around 7:30 p.m, Charlotte awoke from her nap to see Lynette putting on a black and brown dress before setting back off for a second trip to the liquor store. Lynette would return from the liquor store with another bottle of Cisco. At about 9 p.m, Darren, who had been the friend that she had called from the liquor store earlier that day, showed up to Charlotte's house, and Lynette met him outside with a hug before sitting in his lap and kissing him in the front yard. Lucy, Lynette's cousin, had gone for a lie down and was awoken at around 10 p.m. when Lynette had turned on the hall light to change her clothes again. This time, Lynette got changed into a pair of tight faded jeans, a blue midriff tank top under a long-sleeved brownish plaid shirt, and a pair of black and white high-heeled sandals. According to Lucy, Lynette seemed to have been sniffling, as if she'd been crying, but Lynette didn't reveal to Lucy what exactly had been wrong. At this same time, one of Lynette's children also woke up and asked for some more milk, though they had been out of milk, and so Lynette said that she would walk to the liquor store and get some. That would be the last time that Lucy would see Lynette. At some point after Lynette had left the house, Charlotte was awoken by one of Lynette's babies crying. Darren, who was Lynette's friend who had come over, had still been at Charlotte's house, and he told Charlotte that Lynette had gone to pick up her check from Baker's restaurants, and then she was supposed to meet somebody at the liquor store to, quote, make some money. Interestingly, when the manager at Baker's restaurant was shown a photograph of Lynette, he said that he'd never seen her before. Darren woke up Lucy at around 11 p.m. to tell her that he had been worried that Lynette hadn't come back home yet. At around 1 to 2 a.m, Darren took a walk around the block to see if he could find her, but he was unable to, and he ended up spending the rest of that Sunday night into Monday morning waiting for Lynette to come back home. That Monday morning, the father of Lynette's youngest child arrived at Charlotte's home, and when he learns that Lynette hadn't yet come home, he waited around all day with Darren, hoping that she would show up. By the time the clock struck struck 5 p.m. that evening, Darren and the father of Lynette's youngest decided to go to the liquor store to see if anybody knew where Lynette might have been. But when they asked, nobody had seen Lynette since 9:30 p.m. the night before. It was at that point that the father of Lynette's youngest took his son to his grandmother's house. The investigators had been interested in the goings-ons at this liquor store, and so they decided to pay a visit on the 29th of September. They asked the owner if they could watch the CCTV tape of the night that Lynette went missing, but the owner told them that the tape of September 20th had already been recorded over. And so the detectives decided to go speak to Bob Olson, who had been the clerk that had been working the night that Lynette went missing. Bob told them that Lynette had come to the store 3 times that night and had made 3 phone calls, and that on her last trip to the store at about 9:30 p.m, she told Bob that she'd be back at 11 p.m. to talk to him. However, Lynette didn't show up, and so he and the stock clerk left the liquor store at 11:07 p.m. The detectives found it to have been suspicious that a 25-year-old woman would be meeting up with Bob, who'd been twice Lynette's age, so late at night. Quote, "I didn't think at the time he was being totally honest." The detectives would later learn during a subsequent interview with Lucy, Lynette's cousin, that there had been no phone at Charlotte's home, and so they would often use the payphone at the liquor store, that they would shop there for items other than alcohol, and that Lynette had worked out a deal with the night clerk, Bob Olson, in which Bob would pay Lynette money so that he could touch her. Victim 4. Friday the 23rd of October 1998 at about 10 p.m. A phone call is connected to the emergency services in which it is reported that there had been a woman's body floating in the California aqueduct in Hesperia. This call came in just a month after Tina Renee Gibbs' body had been dumped in the same aqueduct some 385 miles to the north. Detective Frank Gonzalez arrived at the pumping station on Amargosa Road, which was just west of Interstate 15, at about 11:20 p.m. that evening. Detective Gonzalez awaited the arrival of the rest of his team, who then set up lighting that would illuminate the area. They were then able to collect evidence and photograph the death scene, looking for any signs of tire tracks, shoe prints, or any other evidence that could have been left by the killer or killers. Detective Gonzalez maneuvered himself down the embankment where he could see the victim's naked body caught in one of the gates underneath the pumping station. It had been discovered by 2 guards. Due to the fact that the victim had been naked, Detective Gonzalez made an initial presumption that the victim had been murdered during a sexual assault. Interestingly, when the detective got closer to the victim, he was shocked to see that the victim's chest had a circular indentation where the victim's left breast used to be. It was at that point when Detective Gonzalez knew that this death had not just been a personal one, but one that had been violent. It wasn't long after this discovery that the sheriff's dive team arrived to recover the victim's body. After doing so, the dive team dived to the bottom of the aqueduct to see if they could find any more evidence, but their searches were fruitless. Meanwhile, Detective Gonzalez took a closer look at the victim's body and was able to establish that there had been a scar on her stomach and ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicative of the fact that she had been bound. The coroner's investigator then took the victim's fingerprints before placing her into a body bag to be transported for an autopsy. These fingerprints were entered into the California ID system later that same night, and within hours they had a massive lead. A match. The victim had been 29-year-old Patricia Ann Tamez. Patricia Ann Tamez had been born on the 25th of April 1969 in McAllen, Texas, to parents Rodolfo and Anna Tamez. When Patricia Anna Tamez had been 2, her parents had gotten a divorce, which saw her dad Rodolfo take her from Rio Grande Valley to Santa Barbara. Rodolfo and Patricia would move again to Ventura, then to Berkeley, which had been where she had gone to high school. Patricia was described by those who knew her as a normal child who enjoyed playing with her dolls, riding her bike, and the likes. She'd kept several pets, including rabbits and a parakeet, and had given the parakeet a funeral after it had died. Patricia had been an average student at school, though she had been able to meet any intellectual challenges if she had set her mind to it. Rodolfo would later describe how he'd always remember the day when a 4-year-old Patricia had been waiting for him to get home so that she could tell him that she'd thrown away all of her baby bottles as, according to Patricia, she was a big girl now and could could drink from a glass. When Patricia had been 8 years old, her father Rodolfo remarried and would go on to have 2 children with his new wife. Notably, Patricia would get on well with her step-siblings. As a teenager, Patricia loved to cook food and was described as having a weakness for fast food. It was her guilty pleasure. And tragically, it had been this love of food and her dysmorphic view of her own body that saw her trying different diet pills in order to lose weight. And these diet pills had been her gateway to harder substances. When Patricia had been 19 years old in 1988, she had gotten married to a man with the surname Prine. And 2 years later, in July of 1990, Patricia was arrested for the first time in Lake County on the charges of possession of drugs and hypodermic needles. It had been her father, Rodolfo, that had bailed her out of jail, and Patricia explained that she had taken the fall for her husband, who she described as being a drug addict, as she had no criminal record. As a result of this arrest, Patricia was sent to a diversion program, after which she filed for divorce and moved back in with her father Rodolfo in Hesperia. It appeared that Patricia was trying to get her life back on track, especially when she enrolled at a community college in Victorville, something which her father had been proud of her for. On all accounts, Patricia had done well in community college and had hoped to go on to become an X-ray technician, though when she applied to a vocational program for it, she was rejected as she hadn't taken human anatomy. Patricia took this setback to heart drastically, and instead of enrolling in an anatomy class to tick that checkbox, she spiraled. Patricia thought herself to have been so unlucky and that nothing ever went right by her. By the time the new year of 1993 came around, Patricia had quit community college and had fallen back into trouble again. You see, Patricia had started a relationship with a man by the name of James, who had been heavily involved with drugs, and they were both arrested. James was arrested and charged with felony possession of pseudoephedrine, which is the main ingredient of methamphetamine, with the intent to manufacture methamphetamine. He was also charged with the count of selling or transporting methamphetamine. Patricia, on the other hand, was charged with possession for sale of methamphetamine. This didn't scare Patricia away from the world of drugs, as just 10 weeks later, they were arrested again. This time, both Patricia and James were arrested and charged with possession with intent to manufacture methamphetamine. Rodolfo felt he had to step in and got Patricia an attorney who, through a plea bargain, managed to bring the charges down. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 190 days in jail, but would go on to be released on her own recognizance on the promise that she'd go to rehab. It's interesting to note that at the time, Patricia had told her probation officer that she had been using drugs since the age of 13 and had been $30,000 in debt. On the 26th of May 1993, Patricia entered an inpatient rehabilitation facility and only stayed for 2 months, which had been just long enough to satisfy the court's requirements of going to rehab, despite the fact that she could have stayed for a full year. In July of 1993, her sentence was suspended and she received 3 years probation, which was actually revoked after she tested positive for methamphetamine 7 times in early 1994. Subsequently, Patricia was ordered to go to jail for a year, though somehow she avoided jail time and ended up back in rehab instead of in jail. Patricia ended up completing a 15-hour parenting program from the Shafi Adult School in Substance Abuse on the 18th of May 1994, as she had actually been pregnant at the time. In 1995, Patricia gave birth to a baby girl, and it appeared that Patricia had started doing better. She'd been living in low-income housing in Barstow with the father of her baby, and Rodolfo thought Patricia to have been a good mother. This all came crashing down, however, when the baby had been 18 months old, and Patricia had what was described as a psychotic break. It's thought that this psychotic break was brought on by the meth use, which can cause schizophrenic-like symptoms like hallucinations and delusional thinking. The psychotic break started when Patricia had called the police and claims that somebody had broken into her house and moved her knife that had been left out on the countertop. The police would ultimately pick up Patricia on a 5150, which is a term used when the police deem somebody to be a danger to themselves or others, and place the 18-month baby into protective custody. Rodolfo would be granted custody of the baby, with Patricia often visiting her daughter. Patricia would spend 60 days at the MFI Recovery Center in Riverside, but unfortunately it didn't work. And Rodolfo grew more and more distressed that the drugs were destroying Patricia's mind. When she was sober, she was capable of having an intelligent discussion. When she was high, she would ramble and be irrational. As the year progressed, Rodolfo saw Patricia less and less, and she chose to stay with friends instead of stay at his house. Patricia would tell Rodolfo that she wasn't like other addicts, that she'd met in rehab, who'd had horrible childhood experiences that had pushed them into drugs. But to Rodolfo, this was clear evidence that addiction can devastate any family. Quote, "You know, Dad, I don't ever want you to blame yourself for any bad decisions I might have made. You're the best father any daughter could have ever wanted." Rodolfo responded to his daughter, quote, "We'll fight this demon. We'll beat it." It had been in October of 1996 that Patricia would be arrested once more, though this time for attempted grand theft of items worth $400 to $1,000 at St. Mary's Hospital in Apple Valley. She had been confronted by hospital staff after a brief struggle with security. She was then handcuffed and detained. Patricia had stopped reporting to her probation officer in mid-June, though there is no record of any charges being filed in that hospital theft case. It was immediately clear that Patricia's mental state had been disintegrating and getting far worse. It had been on the 20th of January 1997 that Patricia had been arrested in Victorville for commercial burglary, which saw her going to jail until the 7th of February. Patricia would be arrested once more on the 6th of March, but this time for sending a false bomb, stalking and making terrorist threats at the Army Armory in Victorville. She'd once again be released on her own recognizance until sentencing. And in June, she was arrested for petty theft from a retail store. It had been during this arrest that somebody finally noticed Patricia's mental state had been erratic. The court therefore ordered Patricia to undergo psychological evaluation before any prosecution could occur. The evaluation was carried out by forensic psychologist Robert L. Suter, with the report being dated for the 7th of August. It is this report that details the only written account of Patricia's version of events, her reality. Let's take a look at what she said. Patricia said in this report that she had left high school after finishing the 11th grade, completing her degree in 1995 through adult education. She then said that her marriage had ended when her husband had been charged with, quote, throwing people off cliffs in carpets. It's important to note that she refused to elaborate any further on that. After divorcing her husband, Patricia explains that she had spent the next 2 years attending classes at 2 community colleges, though she hadn't completed her course and subsequently didn't earn her degree. After that, Patricia said that she, quote, floated around and lived with a man who she would go on to have a baby with. The baby was now living with her mother. Patricia told the psychologist that she had only had one job, which had been a 6-month stint at a college library. Quote, Patricia survived financially by begging. She stated she is at times homeless and in certain instances, she sleeps in a sleeping bag under a bush. According to the report, Patricia had a difficult time filling out the fairly straightforward and simple intake form, and she demonstrated, quote, overt paranoia and delusional thought processes. It appeared to the psychologist that Patricia didn't appear to have understood the court system or the roles of the prosecutor or even her attorney, and it was as a result of this evaluation and a handful of other factors that the psychologist subsequently diagnosed Patricia with a non-specific psychotic disorder with schizoid traits. The psychologist found Patricia to be incompetent, quote, to assist her own defense in a rational manner, before recommending that she be sent to Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino, quote, for a period of observation and treatment. Patricia underwent inpatient treatment at Patton State Hospital for about 6 weeks after being admitted on the 21st of November, before she was deemed competent enough to face the charges that had been brought against her. Quote, it is critical that Miss Tamez continue taking the prescribed medication while in custody in order to ensure continued competency. Patricia then agreed to another plea deal in February of 1998, in which she pleaded guilty to making terrorist threats in exchange for 3 years of probation, going to rehab, and no jail time. Quote, Ms. Tamez feels that she is in dire need of rehabilitation as well as psychological treatment. She is currently scheduled to enter a sober living rehabilitation program and hopes to be a resident of that program for approximately 8 months. Quote, I just want to turn my life around. I know it's never too late. I want to work on my recovery, get a place of my own, and become a good citizen. Patricia would then meet with her probation officer, who noted that she already had 409 days of, quote, custody credits, and who reiterated that violations of her probation could result in state prison time. Sadly, a few days after that meeting, Patricia was actually turned away from the Gibson House for Women in San Bernardino, which is a treatment facility tailored specifically for women who were struggling with addiction, as she had been intoxicated. It seems that after being rejected from the sober living program, Patricia's case fell through the cracks of the system, and she tragically ended up back on the streets. Quote, you know, you get to the point where when you've got this type of addiction, you have nothing left to sell. You sell your body. It was the addiction that, you know, put her there, which was a quote from her father, Rodolfo. Rodolfo would always remember the last time that he saw his daughter Patricia, a memory he'd replay in his mind over and over and over again. You see, Rodolfo had gone to a friend's house to use the internet, and Patricia had been there. He took the opportunity to remind her that, quote, life is short, don't waste it, do something with your life. According to Rodolfo, Patricia seemed to have been rational, lucid, and clear-headed that day. She handed Rodolfo a red ribbon that said, quote, "Drugs destroy dreams," while telling him that she wanted him to have it. When Patricia was getting ready to leave, Rodolfo offered to take her for a hamburger, but he unfortunately ended up having to stay at his friend's house as he had to deal with some kind of a computer problem. Rodolfo said to Patricia, quote, "Okay, mijija, take care." Mijija meaning my daughter in Spanish, also excuse my Spanish pronunciation. Rodolfo had said it several times to Patricia, and he wished deep down that he could give her something more helpful, but it had been the best that he could do. Patricia had worked the streets on the southeast corner of 6th and D Street in Victorville 3 to 5 days a week, and a man called Larry would work across the street and would often see her out of his office window. Larry would see Patricia soliciting dates and getting into cars with men before returning a little while later to work more, and Patricia would actually go into Larry's office to ask for food, water, or cigarettes, which he would try to give to her. It'd been on the 22nd of October between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. in the afternoon when Larry had seen a black 18-wheeler with white writing on the driver's side pull up to the corner and block his view of Patricia. As the truck had been making a right-hand turn to head east on Highway 18, which was also called D Street, he saw Patricia close the door and pull her jacket through the window. That would be the last time he ever saw Patricia. Larry would later tell the authorities that the driver had been a white man in his mid-30s with dark hair and what looked to have been several days' worth of beard growth. The next day, Patricia would be found dead in the California aqueduct, 8 miles to the south of Victorville. On Saturday, the 25th of October 1998, in the late morning, Detective Gonzalez and another detective went to Rodolfo's house in Hesperia to carry out the official notification of Patricia's death. It had been Detective Gonzalez who had led the conversation, first asking Rodolfo if he had been Patricia's father, to which he said that he was, then asking for some ID. Rodolfo had initially thought the detectives had been there to tell him that his daughter Patricia had been arrested again, though it slowly dawned on him that the police don't show up at your house to tell you that. Something else had been very wrong. The detectives asked Rodolfo when the last time had been when he had seen Patricia, to which he told them that he had last seen her about a week ago. It was then that the detectives told Rodolfo what had happened to his only daughter, Patricia, including the facts that her breast had been removed. Rodolfo would later describe that he felt a pain so great that he couldn't cry until the detectives had been about to leave, and from that day on, he was haunted by the thoughts that Patricia might have been alive when she was discarded in the aqueduct. After the official notification had taken place, Detective Gonzalez returned to the aqueduct to take a look at the death scene with fresh eyes, but he found nothing new. The following day, on Sunday the 25th of October, the detectives returned with the sheriff's search and rescue team in order to conduct an expanded search. Due to the fact that the area had been wide open and in plain view of cars that passed by on Amagosa Road, Detective Gonzalez determined that Patricia must have been dumped somewhere upstream and then had floated down the aqueduct. He then set to work in establishing a potential dump site, tracing the aqueduct west a few miles until he found somewhere promising, a dirt turnout next to a bridge where the aqueduct crossed Interstate 395, which was about a mile from Interstate 15. The autopsy on Patricia's remains had taken place on Wednesday the 28th of October 1998 and was carried out by Dr. Stephen Trenkle, a pathologist and medical examiner for San Bernardino County. The pathologist took swabs from the remains for a sex kit to be completed, and he made note of the fact that Patricia had hemorrhaging in the whites of her eyes and pinpoint hemorrhages on her face and upper lip. These had both been factors indicative of strangulation. Patricia also had pale marks around her wrists and ankles, which implied that she had been bound. The pathologist then uncovered that only the right ankle showed any signs of hemorrhaging, which meant that the other binds were likely tied while her heart was barely beating, if at all. It was then noted that Patricia had a 6 by 6 inch sized hole in the deepest layer of fat over the chest wall muscle, which had been where her left breast had been cut away, apparently using some kind of sawing motion and a fairly sharp instrument. Now, Dr. Stephen Trenkle had been unable to determine whether or not Patricia had been alive or dead when her breast had been removed, due to the fact that the area had very little blood flow, and if there had been any bleeding, it would have been washed away while Patricia had been in the aqueduct's water. A second pathologist by the name of Dr. Yeager would examine Patricia's breast later on and determines that it had most likely been severed post-mortem. Patricia's brain had been found to have been swollen during the autopsy, which occurs when the brain is deprived of oxygen, blood, or glucose, and this is indicative of strangulation. The pathologist noted that the most significant injury that indicated the strangulation to have been in the neck. There had been no fracture in the the neck, but bleeding was found on the right side around the thyroid cartilage, which is where the Adam's apple protects the vocal cords. Now, Dr. Stephen Trenkle would then proceed to cut open Patricia's back, something that he would later state he didn't always do during an autopsy. It had been after doing so that he discovered a significant amount of bleeding in the center of Patricia's spine, and the fact that her back had been broken. This injury was determined to have been inflicted while Patricia was still alive, and it would have rendered her paralyzed from the mid-chest down. Dr. Stephen Trenkle waited almost 2 months for the results of the toxicology tests and microscopic examination of tissues to come back before declaring the official cause of death. The official cause of death was determined to have been strangulation, most likely by the killer's hands and not by a ligature. The pathologist stated that Patricia had been dead before she was thrown into the water of the aqueduct. It was noted that the toxicology screening shows that Patricia's liver had been inflamed, which was often seen in people who have taken prescription drugs or abused street drugs, but the tox screening detected no traces of any drugs, albeit illicit or prescription, in her blood. Patricia had been sober. The detectives were at a loss for who was responsible for the brutal murder of Patricia. At least, that was until the following month, when a drastic turn of events occurred that uncovered the truth behind not just the murder of Patricia and Tamez, but also Lynette White, Tina Renee Gibbs, and the Jane Doe known as Torso Girl. It had been at about 7 p.m. on Monday, the 2nd of November 1998, when a man by the name of Wayne Adam Ford had phoned up his older brother Rodney Ford and told him, quote, "I'm in some real bad trouble and I think the police are looking for me. I need your help." Rodney immediately knew that something had been seriously wrong with his younger brother, and without a second thought made the 5-hour-long drive to Ocean Grove Lodge, which was a motel in Trinidad, California. Trinidad being located about half an hour to the north of the town of Eureka, which had been where Rodney and Wayne Adam Ford had both grown up. Rodney arrived at the motel at about 1 a.m. and went straight into the cabin in which Wayne had been staying. And when he saw his younger brother Wayne, he noted just how bad he looked, describing him as being unkempt and emotionally ragged with messy hair and red eyes that told Rodney he had been crying when Rodney had arrived. Wayne gave Rodney a big hug before they both went into the motel cabin and spoke for nearly 2 hours. Rodney found it particularly difficult to follow along with what Wayne had been saying to him as he cried and he rambled to Rodney, jumping from one topic to another. Rodney would later describe Wayne as talking nonsense. After almost 2 hours of Wayne talking this nonsense to his brother, who had driven the long 5-hour drive to see him, he became more serious and told Rodney, quote, "I hurt some people, and I don't want to hurt anybody anymore." Though, when Rodney asked him to elaborate, Wayne refused. He just reiterated that he wanted to get help as he didn't want to hurt people anymore. Quote, "I want to go to the sheriff's, I want to turn myself in." It was at that point that Rodney told Wayne that he had been exhausted from having travelled so far, telling him, quote, "Let's just go to sleep. We'll wake up in the morning, go get some breakfast and work this out." The brothers awoke on Tuesday the 3rd of November 1998 at around 7:30 a.m, with Rodney suggesting that they both get showered and get cleaned up before going on to get something to eat. They went out to get breakfast at the Denny's located just off the highway in Eureka, and it had been at breakfast that Rodney decided that he would try again to find out the particulars of what was going on with his younger brother. When Rodney brought up the subject of who exactly Wayne had hurt, Wayne shut him down, saying, quote, "I don't want to talk about that right now. I just want to spend the day with you. Let's go and look at the apartments where we lived as kids." And that is exactly what they did. They travelled over to the apartments in which they'd lived in as kids. After that, they went to a few different nostalgic locations around the city. Now, according to Rodney, one minute Wayne would appear to be fine and in good spirits, and in the next minute he would break down crying. And Rodney's concern and worry for his younger brother only grew as he started to think about what Wayne hadn't told him. Quote, "How did you hurt some people?" Rodney asked Wayne. "If I tell you, you won't love me. You'll hate me. I love you. I'm your brother. I hurt some people bad, and they don't have to worry about anything anymore." Rodney was understandably extremely concerned when he heard Wayne say that last sentence. Rodney and Wayne quickly came to an agreement that Rodney shouldn't be placed in a position where he could get into trouble for whatever Wayne had done. Though Rodney knew that, as he knew that Wayne had hurt some people, he couldn't let Wayne just walk away, especially if he could be seen as an accomplice after the fact if he did. Rodney's concern as to who exactly Wayne had hurt began to expedite after Wayne continuously continuously spoke about how, quote, screwed up his life was, and of how he was never going to see his son. You see, Wayne had actually tried to kill himself a couple of years earlier after divorcing his ex-wife, and at that point he had spoken about killing his ex-wife too, though Wayne reassured Rodney that both his ex-wife and his son were okay. But he did refuse to say much more besides the fact that he wanted to turn himself in. It did, though, appear as if Wayne was actually avoiding going to the sheriff's office. Quote, once he gave himself up, he said he knew he wouldn't see Rodney anymore because he was never going to get out of jail. The only one who could forgive him was God. Quote, I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to live with myself. I deserve to die. As noon became late afternoon, Wayne suggested that he and Rodney go to the cinema together to watch a movie, once more avoiding doing what Wayne had said he wanted to do, turn himself in. 15 minutes into the movie, Rodney had enough. He leaned over to Wayne and said, quote, we need to go to the sheriff's. It's getting late. Wayne replied to Rodney, quote, I don't want to go now. Rodney got the impression that Wayne meant he didn't want to go right now at that moment, and so replied with, quote, well, we're going. Rodney led Wayne out of the movie theatre before driving them over to their grandmother's house, which was located just a few blocks away from the courthouse where the sheriff's department was. Rodney thought that Wayne might need a calm and relaxing walk before turning himself in. When they had been about 10 minutes away from the sheriff's department, Wayne started to change his mind. Quote, I don't want to go now. Rodney got the impression that Wayne meant that he now didn't want to go at all anymore. Wayne told Rodney that he was worried that once he went in there, he would never come out again. It was at this point that Rodney told his younger brother that he'd call up the FBI or whoever he needed to in order to make it easier for Wayne to feel better and more confident about turning himself in. It's interesting to note that Rodney did actually make a call on his cell phone at around 6 p.m. to an 800 number, which he thought to have been the number for the San Francisco FBI field office. Rodney left a voice message on this number, which comforted Wayne enough to go into the sheriff's office. What the brothers didn't know had been that the phone number had been for a private company called Federal Prison Industries, and not the FBI. Once Rodney and Wayne had entered the sheriff's office, Rodney had been the one to pick up the wall phone and speak with the receptionist. He told the receptionist that they needed to see the sheriff as his younger brother Wayne wanted to turn himself in. When Rodney was asked why, he explained, quote, he said he wanted to hurt some people and he wants to be off the streets. The receptionist obtained Wayne's full legal name and date of birth, which they ran through the system, but no results were returned and no flags were raised. The receptionist then asked Rodney if they could speak directly with Wayne, and when Wayne was handed the wall phone, he told the receptionist the same thing that Rodney had. The receptionist asked Wayne if he had any weapons on him, to which he said that he didn't, before he was asked to take a seat and was informed that somebody would be out shortly to speak with him. As the brothers waited for someone to come out and speak with them, Wayne told Rodney that he'd decided he wanted to leave, but Rodney told him that he wasn't going anywhere. After waiting for about 20 minutes, Deputy Michael Gainey came out to speak to them. He approached the brothers and asked Wayne why exactly he had been turning himself in, to which Wayne repeated that he'd hurt a lot of people. The deputy told him that they needed to take it one step at a time and that he needed some basic information first, such as where Wayne had lived and what he'd done exactly. Wayne told the deputy that he didn't want to hurt anyone anymore, and it was at this point that Sergeant Michael Thomas joined the group and noted Wayne to have appeared to be anxious and unsettled. The sergeant and deputy explained again to Wayne that they needed more information, which prompted Wayne to motion to one of the front pockets of his jacket and say, quote, once you see what I have in my pocket, you'll know. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Alarm bell set off the two officers as to what exactly had been in Wayne's pocket. Could it be a weapon of some kind? When they asked Wayne, he failed to actually respond to them. Sergeant Michael Thomas then asked Wayne whether he could look inside the pocket, which prompted Wayne to reach for the pocket. The sergeant immediately stopped Wayne and told him that they'd go into his pocket for safety purposes. The sergeant and the deputy asked Wayne if there'd been anything in his pocket that might hurt them if they reached in to take it out, and Wayne reassured them that it hadn't been anything like that. And so the sergeant reached down and lifted the external flap of Wayne's pocket as the deputy pulled it away from Wayne's chest. When they peered inside, they could see what appeared to have been a Ziploc sandwich bag. Both of the officers then decided to put on a pair of latex gloves before proceeding. The deputy then pulled out the pocket again while Sergeant Michael Thomas reached in to grab the Ziploc bag. Wayne looked down at the ground as the sergeant examined the Ziploc bag. It appeared to have contained something fleshy and had been leaking fluid into his palm. Sergeant Michael Thomas immediately recognized what he had been looking at. It had been some fatty yellow tissue with a brown nipple. It was a human female breast. And that's everything that I have for you in part 1 of this multi-part series covering the case of Wayne Adam Ford. We'll be picking up in part 2, which will be next week, next Sunday's episode, where we will talk about the aftermath, talk about Wayne, who he was growing up, and all the events that led up to what happened. Thank you so much for watching this episode in my Curious Case True Crime series. Be sure to hit that bell icon so you can be notified as soon as I post the next part. If you have a case you want to request, be sure to go to requestacase.com and send in your case requests there. And with all that being said, I will see you in the next case.